Mr. Rob Manfred was in Cuba and saw that historic game between the Rays and the Cuban national team, and he joins us now on the Michael Kay Show. Rob, how you doing?
Hey, Michael. Hey, Don. How are you?
We're doing great. So it looked like it was a magnificent place and time. What was it like sitting there?
Well, the atmosphere in the stadium was phenomenal. What you kind of have to know to appreciate the whole thing is that people started getting to the ballpark in the early morning because they were concerned about the security lockdown and whatnot. When I got there at 10 o'clock for a game that started at 2, the stadium was probably half full. And the energy just kind of kept building as we got closer and closer to game time. It was just a wonderful atmosphere.
Now, explain, because we had a conversation yesterday about it, the selection process of why it was the Rays that represented Major League Baseball.
Well, we had a tremendous amount of interest among the teams in going to Cuba. And we kind of made the requirements for the trip clear, and we got down to slightly more than a dozen teams, right around a dozen teams that were still interested in going, and we decided that there was no fair way to pick among the teams other than to have a lottery, and we literally had a lottery. We put a ball with a logo from each of the 12 teams in a basket, covered it up with a blanket. I picked the ball out myself, and just in case there are any doubters, there is a videotape of this process taking place. So that's how we got the Rays.
Well, all due respect, Rob, you should have called up David Stern and had a frozen envelope or something, because, the Dodgers or the Yankees or the Mets or the Cubs, it would have even brought more eyeballs to it. The Tampa Bay Rays are a nice team, but they don't even draw at home.
Well, look, I think there's two sides to this coin. First of all, the Rays were unbelievably cooperative. Their players were excited. They really engaged with the people in Cuba. We couldn't have asked for more from the team. And, we're a 30-team league. And it's important that we have iconic franchises like the Yankees and the Dodgers. But it's also important that we take the opportunity to highlight some of our lesser-known franchises in situations like this.
How about the political aspect of it, Rob? It's hard. It's an elephant in the room, right? I'm sure you heard the comments from Dan Le Batard. You're going to Cuba. The President of the United States is sitting next to Raul Castro, who's, in a lot of people's minds, a murderer. So how do you deal with what's good for baseball, what's good for the country, but also the optic of being at this place and being around people that make a lot of, especially Cuban Americans, very uncomfortable?
Well, I think it's important for us that we lined up behind the White House on this effort to try to improve relations with Cuba for the benefit of the Cuban people. And, we felt it was important when we began to engage on this topic to be a part of this historic moment, again, with the focus not being on making a comment on or certainly not supporting the existing Cuban regime, but instead trying to make things better for the Cuban people.
Rob, become my eyes for me, because I would have loved to have gone on that trip. So what is Cuba like? I've read that it almost seems like it's frozen in time in 1957. Is it that sort of country?
Well, honestly, it would be better if it were frozen. The old part of Havana in particular has what you realize when you look at it was at one time beautiful architecture. I'm sure it was a great city at one time, but your overwhelming impression is it's just extremely run down, in a state of disrepair, and it's a little disheartening, to tell you the truth.
Now, also another thing, and one of the reasons that you went there and the baseball contingency went there, Rob, you don't want people dying to try to escape Cuba to play in the Major League. So how are you going to work a deal like that? Is that in the process right now? Do you have to deal with Tony Clark and the union? Because I know this is something you want to get done.
Well, let me say this. This is a second answer to Don's question about going to Cuba. There's a big picture here, but there's also a baseball-specific picture here. We have what we regard to be a very serious issue, a really serious risk in terms of the way the things that Cuban players are doing in order to get out of Cuba and have a chance to play in Major League Baseball. We thought the trip would put focus on this issue. It gave us great access to, the highest-ranking officials in both governments, which is really important because it's a four-way negotiation here in a lot of ways. We need to make an agreement with the MLBPA, as we do with all, methods of entry into Major League Baseball. But we need to make that agreement within the context of the overall relationship between the United States and Cuba, and we're going to need some help from the government in order to make that agreement.